Welcome to the closing chapter of the first book of Peter. This is the chapter 5, and one of the greatest teachings regarding church leadership and how we are to lead, who is to lead, and the purpose for which leaders have been chosen for the church. In this chapter, the leaders are charged with the responsibility of leading the church, and there are a number of names, a number of thoughts about who the leaders are. So we'll delve into it. But first, let me say from the standpoint of leading a church, I like the parable or fable of the boy, the man, and the donkey. As the boy, the man, and the donkey were traveling into a town one day, they were met by a man, and the man asked the question, "Why is no one riding on the donkey?" And the man said, "Well, we just decided to walk." He said, "But the donkey is a beast of burden, so one of you should be riding on the donkey." And so the man decided he would place the boy on the donkey, excuse me, that he would ride the donkey while the boy led the donkey. And then he was met by a man who said, "Why, old man, are you riding the donkey?" And in disrespect for the little boy, who is a minor and should be riding the donkey. And so the old man got off of the donkey, and first he decided that he and the boy would ride the donkey together. And so they were riding into to town, the boy and the donkey, excuse me, the boy and the man riding on the donkey. They met another man who said, "You are being cruel to an animal. Why are you riding on the donkey?" He said that's a cruelty to animals. So the next time they saw the man, he and the boy were carrying the donkey. My point in telling this story is that as a leader of a church, there will always be someone who has an idea of how you can do it better, and even will make suggestions that what you are doing is going the wrong way. So, never in my life as a pastor was I ever able to meet everyone's need. And I'm reminded of this when I read this parable and think about it. In this last chapter, these are the basic ideas. First, in verses 1 through 4, there's the instruction to the elders. And the instruction to the elders were from Peter. He was urging them, that is, the elders, to shepherd or care for the flock willingly, not for their own gain, but for the benefit of those that they were leading. The elders were also encouraged to set the example to be a servant leader. In the denomination that I have served in, I recall in the 70s, there was a great movement to show the importance of servant leadership in the church. It was met with a good deal of resistance across the United States, because there were those who were and many who are serving very large congregations, and their idea of leadership was that it was from the top down. Well, I think we can get by the example of Jesus and the instructions of uh, Peter to these churches scattered and or part of Asia Minor, that they were as leadership to serve as example. And of course, we know even Jesus in the upper room took the towel and girding himself and took the pitcher and washed the disciples' feet showing that he was not greater than they were, and that a master or a leader should by all means lead by example, being a servant. He encouraged the younger members of the church to be submissive to elders. Now, we know that Paul gave a lot of instructions regarding the importance of a submissive relationship within the church, within the marriage, within the workplace, in the government, that we must indeed not always be rebels. There's a time to be rebellious and to be resistant, but in most cases, we can find a way to be submissive without compromising any of our principles, but giving a sense of unity as we do that. So he was saying to the young members, to be submissive, have a spirit of humility within the community of faith. The call for humility extends to all members, highlighting the importance of mutual respect and support. Uh, and so this was his encouragement to them. But also, he pointed out how important it is to be spiritually vigilant. Peter advises believers to humble themselves before God, promising that they will lift him up, and God promising that he will lift them up in due time. They are encouraged to cast their anxieties on God, who would care for them, and he warned them that the devil is prowling always with the destructive nature and idea of destroying those who are trying to follow Christ. But throughout this book, from the very beginning, much of the information that that Peter taught was to encourage and give assurance in the midst of the trials that they were facing, that God was going to always be with them. He reminded them that our suffering now is is temporal, and that God will strengthen us to face the suffering of life, but also its purpose is to honor God when we do that. And so he gives final greetings as he thanks Sylvanus, who apparently was the one who was his scribe, or in the Old Testament vernacular, the amanuensis, who was there to record his words, but also he identifies where he is writing from. And many people believe that when he referred to Babylon, he was referring to Rome. There are others, however. J. Vernon McGee believes he actually was writing from Babylon, but he uh, closes with a word of peace, as often the New Testament letters end with. But we have to be careful about being humble in the face of life. We live in a day when everybody can find a place on social media from the comfort of their home or from a special place. They can become a celebrity and followed by many people. We see people who play ball on TV and have the whole world watching them, and it's very difficult for them to remain humble. But as people of faith, when we come to serve in the Lord's house, we are not to seek that place of recognition, but to remain humble. Those of us who are charged with the ministerial role must be very careful about that. Here is a description of what the role of the elders was, and we're going to look at the different words describing of church leadership in the next slide. Elders are called to shepherd the flock of God, overseeing the spiritual well-being of the congregation. I grew up in a rural church where we never knew the pastor as pastor. He was just the preacher. Many of the churches in our early days were all bivocational pastors, and many of them just carried that title as a preacher. But we're looking to different uh, uh, names for leadership. However, I did have the role model of a preacher being the pastor of the church, and he is to lead with humility. He is entrusted with the important task of guiding the church, and he is to equip the saints, that is, followers of Christ, to do the ministry of the church. Verse 1 says, I exhort, or I instruct the elders among you as a fellow elder. Peter saw himself as an elder, as a leader of the church. But he says, as I do that, we all are witness to the sufferings of Christ. We are called to remember and recognize that Christ is our example of suffering, and that he suffered prior to our suffering. Now, of course, the word itself, martyria, is the word for martyr, and that is also the word that is translated witness. But we know the sufferings of Christ, and we are to be as one who shares in the glory that ultimately is revealed to us in later times. And so we are exhorted as leaders to follow Christ's example and to be the shepherd humbly caring for the sheep. Verse 2, shepherd God's flock among you, not overseeing them out of compulsion, but willingly. Now, in the early days when I began ministry, many pastors, as someone has said, they were called and mad about it. I grew up with so many pastors who seemed to have the idea that God wrestled them to the ground and they had no other choice but unwillingly, some of them, to go in ministry. Well, I think that we are called to be ministers who find fulfillment in what we do and be joyful about that. But he says we are to do it willingly, as God would have. And we're not to do it out of greed for money, but we are to eagerly do the work of ministry. I can say after 62 years of being ordained and of having served for 55 years actively as a pastor, if I were able today and someone would have me, I would be right there doing it because it is the love of my life, it is the fulfillment of my life. Then verse 3, not lording it over those entrusted to you, but being examples to the flock, and not to abuse your power. And of course, I have known, and you have perhaps been in what I call toxic churches where the pastor is an authoritarian and he is dictating to others what they should or should not do, what they could and could not do, and what they can and cannot believe. Well, he is warning against that kind of authoritarian leadership. We are all subject to God as the pastor, as the people. And so he is saying, be careful of that. In verse 4, and when the chief shepherd appears, meaning Christ, you will receive him, you will receive the unfading crown of glory. When Christ comes, the award you receive is the crown of glory that it does not fade and that is always and is permanent. Perhaps you remember the poem by Edgar Guest. I'll not read it all, but just remind you that we are better off seeing a visual image, as the poet says. I'd rather see a sermon than hear one any day. I'd rather one should walk with me than merely show the way. The eye is a better pupil and more willing than the ear. Fine counsel is confusing, but examples always clear. And the best of all preachers are the men who live their creeds, for they for to see good put in action is what everybody needs. We are not to abide by the saying that my mother would say to us when we would call her out in violating one of the principles she had taught us. She would say to us, "Do as I say, not as I do." But I would say that we are by example a sermon that can be read of all men and often is, and that people see in our example far more than what they hear in our words. I've always been of the opinion that more lessons are caught, that is, what people see, than what they hear. More lessons are caught than taught. So, Guest's poem is a good one, and we need to pay attention to how we give our example. Now, here are a number of titles given to New Testament offices of the church. The first is apostolos, which was an apostle. An apostle basically is one who is sent out to do the work of ministry. And so there were apostles, but they were sent out to do ministry. One of the common ones is elder. This is the term that we just read. It is the word pres buteros, and it's the word elder. We get the word Presbyterian, and that's how the Presbyterian Church functions in their leadership. And then you have deacon, diakonos, which is common to us in the church where I served, where I grew up. There were deacons, and there was the pastor. The pastor, of course, was the one in charge, but the deacon were to act as servants, as we find in the book of Acts. When the deacons were chosen, they were chosen to solve a material problem. The Gentiles, there was complaint that one group was being served better than the others, and so the deacons were given charge over caring for a material thing, that is, caring for those in the church. So that's the word deacon. Then we have the episcopos, our bishop, and of course, the Episcopal Church uses that as their name, and that person is to be in charge. Then this word prophetis is a word for prophet, and of course, prophets of the Old Testament were forthtelling the truth mainly. There were times that they did foretell or give a vision of the future, but their basic role was simply to be a foreteller of the truth. And then we have didaskatos, which the word didactic, our teacher, comes from that. There's a word or a book in the early writings of the first century called the Didache, which was a book containing early teachings of the Christian movement. And so that is the word for teacher. And a pastor is to be both a pastor and a teacher, and many see that as pastor, teacher without the conjunction and. Then there's the word for evangelist. Of course, it is the basic word for evangelon, or the word for good news. And an evangelist is one who is about the business of sharing the good news. And then there's this word, hyporgos, which is the word minister. But the last one is my favorite, poimen. It is in many contexts seen as a shepherd, often interchangeably given as the pastor. That's the title that I prefer. I like the sound of, I like the vision of, and I like the content of the idea that one who is serving the church has a concern for the flock, like the shepherd of the Old Testament, who was the one who was willing to die for his sheep, give himself in service in every regard, one that would be there when needed. And so I like that best of all the ideas. But one thing is for certain is that we are to come humbly, and pastors of all people should lead out as examples in humility. And so Peter is instructing these people in the early church. He gave them encouragement, but he also gave them instruction, and this was that they are not to exalt themselves above God. God will do the exalting, but we are to be humble and allow God in due time to do that. And my mother always, and dad also, instructed us, you don't need to brag on yourself. Let other people do that. Here are some examples about, well, I'll show that in a minute. He continues on, in the same way, you who are younger, be subject to the elders. I I can remember my youth. I knew everything. I could do everything, and all I needed was the opportunity. How little did I understand, how little I knew. However, I had the eagerness and desire to do it, made many mistakes. I would have profited to have taken the instruction of Peter here and to be subject to my elders. I did seek advice and help, but not enough. He says, all of you clothe yourselves with humility toward one another. We are never to see ourselves above anybody else. And many times we ought to really take the position of being below others and offer our service to them. And he tells us clearly that it's God who resists the proud, but he gives grace to the person who is humble, who shows their humility. You remember the story of the Pharisee and the publican, and the Pharisee called upon to pray, and he said, Lord, I thank you that I'm not like that publican. And obviously showing pride as a result. Verse 6, humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that he may exalt you in the proper time. He is the one who is to exalt you. You're not to exalt yourself. And we are to do that by casting all our cares on him, because we know that he cares for us. He continues, he said, be sober minded, be alert. Your adversary, the devil, is always prowling around like a roaring lion so that he can devour you. And so we need to be aware, to be alert. We are to resist, verse 9, we're to resist him, that is the devil, firm in our faith, knowing that the same kind of sufferings are being experienced by your fellow believers throughout the world. We need to be aware that we're not in this by ourselves. Those of us who live here in the United States are fortunate because we are not, we may be ignored, we may be looked at and sometimes considered to be ignorant. But of course, Christ told us that it was, or Paul, I believe it says it was through the ignorance of preaching that men come to know Christ. And so we may face that kind of persecution, but not like others in other parts of the world who are being beheaded or cruelly treated because they are followers of Christ. Verse 10, the God of all grace, who called you to his eternal glory in Christ, will himself restore, establish, strengthen, and support you after you have suffered a little while. This is temporary compared to eternity. And he continues, verse 11, to him be dominion forever. Perhaps you think it could end here. To illustrate the point, there was a preacher out west, who was preaching. He failed to prepare very well. And when he came to the pulpit, he looked out, there was an American Indian sitting there, and he had never preached before an American Indian. And so, for the lack to try to make up for his lack of preparation, he pounded the pulpit, he shouted to the top of the rafters, and of course, the pale face, the other congregants wanted to know how the Indian perceived the pastor. And so as he came out, they asked him the question, how did you enjoy the pastor's preaching today? And the above six words are what he said. He said, I have six words: high wind, big thunder, no rain. And it's very often that's how we present ourselves, as being something we are not. And people can see through and recognize arrogance opposed to humility. There's a story about two brothers who were on a small family farm with their dad. And when they grew up, one of the brothers said, I'm going to stay here and work on the farm. The other brother chose to go to the city to get a good education, to become a person who was well known in the community, even entered into politics. And he came back to visit his brother on the farm. And he says, brother said, you ought to get off of this farm and come with me to town and find your place in society. And of course, it was with an arrogant attitude that he spoke those words. The younger brother who had stayed on the farm put his arm around him and said, brother, let's go out to the fields. And he looked over the wheat and the grain fields, and he said, look out over that field. The only grain that is stalks of grain that are standing high are those where the grain has fallen out. And so they are empty sheaves, and they're standing fall. But the grain that is filled and is still in the on the stem they are the ones that are bowed low. It's only the full heads that bow low, and it is the empty heads that stand high. I think that describes exactly what I heard years ago about a young man who studied hard to preach the sermon. He felt confident about himself to the point of arrogance. And he went to this small church where he got up and he was going to impress them with his knowledge. And he just simply proceeded to do what he thought was to be the right way to preach, and it fell flat. He didn't feel good about it. The people didn't respond well to him. But as he walked down, he met an old preacher who'd been there many years, and he knew the young man was discouraged. And he spoke to the young man and said to him, "If you had gone up the way you came down, you could have come down the way you went up." These are examples and pictures of what it means to be humble in the sight of God, and we need to be careful that we do just that. And he has some closing words for us, and in these words, he wants us to know that we're to stand firm in our grace, we're to greet each other in love, and to be peaceful among the brothers. And so he says in the final words, with the help of Silas. Silvanus is a word that's given in many, but apparently he was the amanuensis. He was a uh, scribe who wrote the words that Peter had for these people who were scattered throughout Asia Minor. He said, "I want to thank him. I have written to you briefly, encouraging you and testifying that this is the true grace of God." But he knew that he could not have done it without Silvanus or Silas helping us. That is a reminder that none of us can succeed in our best efforts alone. I would say that in examination of my own life, that is one of course, many weaknesses, but I've never been able to give up as much as I should have given up to others who were capable of doing far more than perhaps what I entrusted to them. And so this is a word to me as I read it. But he says, stand fast in it. And by that, he means stand fast in the grace of God, in your commitment to God. Remain, because God is going to provide all that you need, and all your needs will be met. And then he continues, she who is in Babylon. Again, a reference probably to Rome. Some say literally it was to and not to Rome, but to Babylon itself. But that is a subject to be debated, and probably no good conclusion will come that everybody is satisfied. But he says, chosen together with you, we send greetings, and so does my son Mark. Mark became at one time a person that was troubling to Paul, but he redeemed himself and became a very good leader in the church, and of course, a gospel writer himself. And so he is lifting Mark up as being a faithful servant. Then he closes with these words, greet one another with a kiss of love. Hospitality was so important in welcoming and also blessing people as they came and went from a home. And so the expression of love among the early church was evident. When someone came to a home, they immediately would wash feet, prepare a meal for them, welcome into home. Sometimes even strangers were given that kind of treatment. But he said, especially among those who are followers of Christ, this should be done. So he said, greet one another with a kiss, and peace to all of you who are in Christ. Now, shortly after this letter, a second one was sent. Someone said is matter of uh, months afterwards because of the discontent and the disruption in the church because of false teaching. And so when we pick up the second book of Peter soon, then we will be dealing with that particular subject. And sometimes the message has to come to us a second time before we really get the message. And that's what we'll take up next time that we meet. Father, thank you for the strength that we have together. Help us to know, Father, that when we are bundled together as wheat in the field, we are stronger. Even the book of Ecclesiastes tells us that two are better, or three are better than two, and that each one of us needs someone to be near us in case we fall so that we can be picked up. Help us to know our codependency in you, and help us to walk as people of faith into our world, displaying the example of Christ to all. For Christ's sake, I pray. Amen.